The trail stretched bleak and endless, a ribbon of mud and stone carved across the high plain. Wind hissed low through the sage, lifting dust into the air until it stung the eyes and choked the throat. Under that gray light trudged a woman and a child, their steps uneven, their breath shallow, their shadows long and wavering on the frozen earth. Clara Whitmore's shawl had once been deep blue, but now it hung faded and frayed about her shoulders, stiff with dust and cold. She clutched it tighter as she walked, though the wind pierced through as if the cloth were no more than cobweb. Her lips were split and bloodless, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Beside her stumbled her daughter Eliza, just 8 years old, clutching a small rag doll to her chest. The doll's yarn hair was braided, though tangled with grit, and the child's pale fingers worked at it absently, as though the familiar pattern might keep her from despair. Behind them sagged the carcass of a wagon, one wheel broken clean from its axle, canvas torn to ribbons by storms. It leaned on its side like a grave marker for the man they had buried days before, husband, father, provider. Fever had carried him off in silence, and the wagon train, pressed forward by fear of winter storms, had not waited. Clara and Eliza had been left on the trail with little food and less hope, two souls set adrift in a land that gave nothing freely. By the time the ridge rose before them, Clara felt her legs giving out. Her breath rattled, her vision swam, and despair, cold, merciless, settled over her. She pulled Eliza close, whispering words she scarcely believed herself, words of faith, of survival. Her knees began to buckle when the sound reached her, the hollow clap of hooves against stone. Out of the pale horizon came a rider. He was alone, seated tall in the saddle of a bay horse, a rifle tied to his pack, his hat pulled low against the wind. His coat was worn but strong, and his bearing spoke not of passing traveler but of a man rooted to the land, accustomed to silence and solitude. As he drew closer, the scar came into view, an old wound, pale and unhidden, running from his cheekbone to his jaw like lightning struck into flesh. His eyes, steady and unflinching, took in the broken wagon, the child's trembling form, the widow's hollow face. Jonas Hale did not speak at once. He reined his horse to a halt a few paces away, the animal's breath steaming in the frigid air. For a long moment there was only the wind, the creak of saddle leather, and the faint whimper of Eliza's lips against her doll. Clara lifted her chin, defiant even in her weariness. She had been stared at before, by strangers, by death itself, and would not bow beneath it now. At last the man dismounted. His boots struck the ground with the weight of finality. He studied them a moment longer, then said in a voice low and certain, "You'll freeze out here." The words, plain as they were, carried the weight of judgment and mercy all at once. Clara felt her knees threaten to give, not from exhaustion this time, but from the shock of reprieve. She swallowed and managed only a nod. Jonas turned without waiting for answer. He lifted Eliza in his arms as though she weighed no more than the doll she clutched, and with his other hand he steadied Clara by the elbow. Few more words were spoken as he mounted again, settling the child before him in the saddle. Clara walked beside, her hand resting against the horse's flank, her body pulled forward by the strange momentum of salvation. The trail wound toward the valley where Jonas kept his land. By the time the cabin came into view, dusk had fallen. Smoke rose faint and steady from the chimney, the only sign of life in a wilderness otherwise abandoned to silence. The cabin was stoutly built, logs notched with care, its porch narrow, its roof pitched against snow. Yet Clara saw first the rocking chair by the door, empty, though placed as if still waiting for someone who might return. Jonas lifted Eliza down gently, and she ran a few paces ahead, her small feet crunching in the frost. He tied the horse, then opened the door without ceremony. The smell of wood smoke and strong black coffee met them, familiar yet foreign after days of hunger and fear. Inside, the room was plain, a stove with coals glowing faint red, a table scarred with knife marks, shelves lined with jars and worn tools. Near the door leaned a rifle, its barrel polished from use, its presence as much a part of the household as any chair or kettle. On the mantel above the fire sat a single object of delicacy, a woman's bonnet, carefully folded, untouched by dust. Clara saw it, and her heart understood without asking. This was not a house of plenty or laughter. It was a house of absence. Jonas set bread on the table, coarse but fresh, and poured coffee into tin cups. Clara lowered herself into a chair, hands trembling as she wrapped them around the warmth. Eliza sat beside her, wide-eyed, her lips smeared with crumbs as she devoured each bite. No questions were asked that night, not of who they were, nor where they had come from, nor what they had lost. Jonas spoke little beyond what was necessary, his voice a gravelly presence against the crackle of the fire. Yet he had given them shelter, and in the harsh ledger of the frontier, that was more than most men would offer. When at last Clara lay awake on a cot in the back room, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, she listened to the sounds of the rancher's house, the scrape of his chair as he sat by the fire, the faint clink of his knife against wood as he whittled, the silence that filled the spaces where another's laughter might once have been. She knew, as surely as the cold pressed against the cabin walls, that they had stepped into the life of a man locked in his own grief. And he, she suspected, had taken in a woman and child carrying their own. Survival had demanded the uneasy bargain. Yet as the night deepened and the wind howled outside, Clara felt, against all reason, that a fragile ember of mercy had been lit. Snow began to fall the next morning, slow and deliberate, each flake spiraling down like an unfinished thought. By midday, the trail behind the cabin was gone, buried under a quiet shroud of white. The land itself seemed hushed, as though winter had laid a heavy hand across its mouth. For Clara and Eliza, the back room of Jonas Hale's cabin became both shelter and cage. The room was narrow, its single window rimed with frost, the light that entered faint and watery. Clara spread her shawl across the cot and tucked her daughter beneath it, watching as Eliza busied herself with her doll. The child had found a length of twine near the woodpile and now braided it carefully into the doll's hair. She whispered as she worked, her lips moving in hushed conversation. Sometimes Clara caught the word papa among the murmurs, and her chest tightened. Eliza spoke to her father as though he lingered just beyond the veil of sight, still listening, still keeping watch. Clara did not interrupt. She only tightened the shawl around her own shoulders and listened to the muffled sound of Jonas outside, his axe biting rhythmically into the woodpile. Each strike rang against the stillness, sharp as grief itself. When Jonas returned with arms full of logs, he passed the doorway without a word. The snow clung to his coat, glistened in the furrow of his scar, and melted into droplets that darkened the floorboards. He stacked the wood by the stove with deliberate care, as though even in solitude order must be maintained. Clara offered a quiet "thank you," but he only nodded and stepped back out into the dusk. So their days passed, the widow and her child in the back room, the rancher in the main. The house itself seemed divided by grief, each corner holding silence of a different kind. At night, when the wind howled against the shutters, Jonas sat by the fire with a block of cedar and his knife. He carved without hurry, shaving curls of wood that fell into his lap like coiled ribbons. Sometimes it became a horse, sometimes a bird, though often it was nothing at all, just a shape smoothed beneath his scarred hands. His eyes did not see the firelight but something behind it, some other place, some other time. Clara, lying wakeful in the back room, would listen to the steady scrape of blade against wood. The sound was strangely human, lonely, insistent, like the voice of a man whittling not wood but memory. One evening, when Eliza had fallen asleep with her doll pressed against her cheek, Clara stepped softly into the main room. She had mended Jonas's shirt, the one she had found torn at the shoulder seam. She laid it folded on the table, her hand lingering there a moment as if to say what her lips could not. Jonas looked up from his carving. His eyes, gray as weathered stone, flicked to the shirt and then to her face. His jaw tightened. "You don't need to do that," he said flatly. Clara held his gaze. "It was torn. I can't sit idle." He said nothing more, only set down the knife, rose, and carried the shirt away. The silence that followed was colder than the wind outside. Clara stood very still, her fingers trembling at her sides, and then returned to her room. She did not weep, though the sting in her chest begged release. Yet small changes came, subtle as thaw beneath snow. Jonas, who had once brewed a single cup of coffee in the morning, began to set two upon the table without remark. He poured one for himself and left the other steaming, as though it had always belonged there. Clara accepted it wordlessly, her hands warming against the tin. At night, when Eliza hummed a lullaby before sleep, soft, broken notes of a tune her father had taught her, Jonas sometimes lingered in the doorway. He did not enter, nor speak, but his frame filled the space like a sentinel. Clara noticed how his hand, always so steady, curled into a fist at his side, as though the melody struck some hidden seam within him. Once, while Eliza slept, Clara found herself studying the scar across his face. It seemed less a mark of violence than a brand of survival, proof that the world had already taken much and he had remained standing. She wondered, though she did not ask, what story it carried. The days grew shorter. The snow deepened. Sometimes distant movement stirred along the tree line beyond the ranch. Riders, faint and fleeting, vanished like smoke between the pines. Jonas said nothing of them, but his eyes sharpened, and he kept his rifle closer to hand. Clara had heard enough whispers along the wagon trail to know, this land was contested, fragile, poised between truce and blood. She prayed the figures were scouts and not harbingers, that the carved charm Eliza had begun wearing around her neck, a bone trinket Jonas said belonged to his late wife's people, might offer unseen protection. One night, as the storm thickened, Jonas sat by the fire whittling again. Clara, sewing by lamplight, gathered the courage to speak. "You keep to yourself," she said gently. His knife stilled. "I prefer it that way." "It isn't good," she whispered. "A man can lose himself in silence." His gaze lifted, the firelight catching the furrow of his scar. For a moment he seemed ready to answer, but then his eyes fell back to the wood in his hand. "Best to lose oneself," he murmured. "Better than losing someone else." Clara lowered her eyes, the thread slipping between her fingers. She understood too well. Widowhood had cut her differently, but from the same blade. Her silence was filled with the voice of her husband, laughter that rose unbidden, memories that clawed at the still hours. Jonas's silence was empty, a shell hardened against intrusion. Both were prisons of grief, fashioned from different stone. That night, as she lay awake, Clara listened again to the scrape of his knife. It sounded less like labor now and more like confession, the steady rhythm of a man remembering the shape of loss. Eliza stirred beside her, whispering in her sleep, "Papa says we'll be warm." Clara's eyes burned, but she pressed her lips against her daughter's hair, breathing in the faint scent of wood smoke and twine. Outside, snow fell heavier, erasing the world. Inside, grief settled like another layer of frost upon them all. Yet beneath it, faint as an ember hidden in ash, lay the knowledge that neither of them was truly alone in their sorrow. For though they had not spoken it, both knew, the wound that marked them was the same. The storm came sudden as judgment. All day the sky had hung low, a gray weight pressing against the ridges, and by dusk the first flakes tumbled down, soft but relentless. By midnight the wind rose, shrieking through the chinks of the cabin, rattling the shutters like a hand determined to force its way inside. Snow piled against the door, hissing against the logs, while the rafters groaned as though the house itself bore the burden of winter. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of smoke and boiled beans. Jonas fed the stove steadily, his scarred hands dark against the glow of the coals. Clara sat on the cot, Eliza pressed close against her, the child wrapped in every quilt the house possessed. The girl's lips were pale, her fingers curled around the small doll she never released, but her eyes stayed fixed on the flames, as though fire alone kept her in this world. Supplies had thinned to near nothing. The jars on the shelf stood mostly empty, the sacks of flour scraped to their last measure. Each meal was smaller than the one before, yet still Clara coaxed Eliza to eat, her voice soft, insistent, willing strength into her daughter's thin frame. Hunger gnawed at them all, a silent predator crouched in the corners of the room. Nights stretched long, filled with the restless turning of bodies too cold to sleep and too weary to rise. Jonas sat by the fire most of those hours, whittling until his lap was a nest of shavings. Clara watched him sometimes through half-closed eyes, wondering if he feared dreams more than hunger. It was on such a night, when the storm beat hardest and the cabin seemed to shrink against the weight of it, that the knock came. It was faint at first, a dull thud swallowed by the howl of wind. Jonas lifted his head, knife stilled in his hand. The second knock was clearer, urgent, unmistakable. He rose in one motion and reached for the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Clara stiffened. Eliza whimpered, clutching her doll tight. Jonas motioned them back, his body tense, his eyes narrowed against the shadows that quivered across the walls. He opened the door with the barrel of the rifle braced forward. Snow swirled in like smoke from a broken chimney, carrying with it a man. He collapsed at the threshold, half buried already in white, his body trembling with cold. His face was weathered, his hair black as raven wing, his chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Blood stained the snow beneath him, bright as fire. For a heartbeat Jonas did not move. His grip tightened on the rifle, suspicion carved deep into every line of his face. This was no lost settler. The man's dress, leather leggings, bone ornament at his wrist, marked him plain as a native of the hills. In this country, that could mean anything, scout, wanderer, or raider. Clara did not hesitate. She dropped to her knees, her shawl sweeping the floor as she bent over the man. Her fingers found his pulse, weak but steady. She looked up at Jonas, her eyes fierce. "He'll die if you leave him." Jonas's jaw worked as though grinding stone. The rifle remained leveled. "He may mean us harm." "He means nothing if he's dead," Clara answered, her voice firm, unshaken. "Let me tend him." For a long moment only the storm answered, clawing at the door. Then Jonas cursed low under his breath, set the rifle aside, and helped drag the man inside. The door slammed against the snow. Clara worked quickly, her hands sure. She boiled water, tore cloth into strips, pressed against the wound at the man's side where blood still seeped sluggishly. She washed away dirt and frostbite, bound the gash with steady fingers. Jonas hovered close, his face shadowed by suspicion, but he did not interfere. Eliza, eyes wide, brought more cloth as her mother asked, though her small hands shook. Hours passed in tense labor. At last the man's breathing steadied, though shallow still, his face pale against the quilts. He drifted into sleep, the storm outside echoing high. Ragged rhythm. When it was done, Clara sat back on her heels, her shawl stained red, her breath coming hard. Jonas studied her in silence, then turned back to the fire, feeding it with sharp, violent thrusts of wood. For 2 days the man lay in the back room, neither speaking nor stirring much. Clara kept vigil, bringing broth to his lips, changing his bandages, murmuring words of comfort he may not have understood. Jonas remained wary, the rifle always close, but he watched Clara's hands as she worked, how steady they were, how determined, how they bore no fear. On the third morning, the storm broke. Sunlight filtered weakly through the frost-blurred glass. The man rose unsteadily, gathered the leather he had shed, and with no more than a glance toward them, made for the door. Clara caught his arm. "You're not strong enough." He shook his head, his eyes unreadable. From a pouch at his belt he drew a small carving, polished smooth from handling, a bone charm in the shape of a bird mid-flight. He bent, placed it gently into Eliza's hand, then straightened with quiet dignity. No word passed his lips, but the weight of the gesture filled the room. Eliza clutched the charm, her eyes bright with wonder. Clara's breath caught, her lips parting with gratitude unspoken. Jonas met the man's gaze across the room. For the span of a heartbeat, something passed between them, not friendship, not forgiveness, but recognition. Then the man stepped out into the snow, his figure swallowed by the white horizon until nothing remained. The cabin fell silent once more. Clara brushed Eliza's braid back, fastening the charm around her daughter's neck with careful fingers. Jonas watched, his scar taut, his expression unreadable. That evening, as Clara stirred the pot of beans, Jonas set another log on the fire and spoke at last. His voice was low, almost reluctant. "You did right." Clara turned, startled. The words were few, but they landed heavy, like stones placed on the foundation of something yet unseen. She gave a faint nod, her eyes soft with both weariness and quiet triumph. Jonas sat in his chair, his gaze fixed on the bone charm glinting against Eliza's breast. He realized then, though he did not speak it, that Clara's strength was not intrusion, nor weakness. It was defiance. It was survival. And it unsettled him, for he had built his solitude like a fortress, only to find its stones shifting beneath her hands. Outside, the storm had passed, but within, something new had begun, fragile, uncertain, yet undeniable as fire struck from flint. Winter thickened, laying its hand heavy across the valley. Snow pressed high against the cabin walls, and the air outside turned so sharp it seemed to flay the skin. Inside, the stove worked without rest, its iron belly glowing red, but the warmth reached only so far. The logs creaked with cold, and the rafters carried a groan as though the house itself protested the strain of holding 3 lives within its frame. With the storm came a different trial, not of hunger or exposure, but of closeness. The rooms, narrow as they were, gave little refuge from one another. Silence that had once felt necessary began to weigh like a stone on the chest. Small sounds carried sharp, the scrape of spoon against bowl, the rustle of pages, the uneven tread of a boot across the floor. Jonas demanded quiet. It was his way. He moved through the cabin like a man guarding sacred ground, each word measured, each noise frowned upon. Clara, at first, respected it. But Eliza was a child, and children could not be bent into silence without breaking something within. One evening, as dusk spread violet shadows across the snow, Clara opened the worn Bible she had carried since her wedding day. Its pages were creased and stained, the ink faded by years of travel. She began to read softly, her voice steady despite the weight in her throat. "Eliza," she said, "listen. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Eliza's eyes brightened, her head resting against her mother's shoulder as the words rolled like a bomb over the cold room. But Jonas's chair scraped hard against the floor. "Quiet," he said, his tone curt. Clara lifted her eyes to him, refusing to lower them. She needs to hear. She needs more than wood smoke and silence. Jonas's scar caught the firelight, harsh in its furrow. Silence keeps you alive. The world out there doesn't care for psalms. It cares for strength. Clara closed the Bible with care, smoothing its cover with her palm. "Strength isn't only the absence of words," she said quietly. "It's the presence of hope." The air tightened, brittle as ice. Jonas did not reply. He turned his face back to the fire, his jaw locked, but his hand trembled once where it rested on his knee. For days afterward, tension lay thick between them. Jonas worked outside longer, chopping wood even when his breath smoked ragged and his fingers stiffened. Clara busied herself inside, mending, sweeping, baking thin bread from what flour remained. They spoke only what necessity demanded. Yet Eliza, as children do, bridged the silence with small gestures, humming a tune, laying her doll in Jonas's lap before running off, tracing patterns in frost on the window while whispering stories her father once told. One afternoon, when the wind had calmed, Jonas returned from the barn carrying Eliza in his arms. She had been playing among the hay, her feet lost in drifts, and he had lifted her before the cold could settle into her bones. Without a word, he set her into the rocking chair by the stove. It was the chair Clara had noticed from the first day, carved smooth, worn at the arms, empty yet not forgotten. Eliza curled into it, her small legs tucked beneath her, rocking gently as the wind sighed beyond the walls. She smiled at the creak of the wood, a sound like heartbeat against silence. Clara's breath caught. Jonas stood behind, his hand briefly resting on the chair's back before withdrawing as though scorched. He turned away, his shoulders rigid, but Clara had seen the moment, the gift, the surrender of something precious. Fragile trust flickered like a flame refusing to die. That night, when the cabin slept, Clara rose for water and found Jonas at the table beneath the lantern. The rifle lay across his lap, and he was running a stone down its barrel, slow and steady. The light carved shadows across his scar, making it seem deeper, almost carved into the bone. His eyes were lowered, but the set of his jaw spoke of memories awake in him, heavy as chains. Clara hesitated at the doorway. For weeks she had wondered, felt the question burning behind her teeth. Now, in the hush of the lantern's glow, she dared. "Your wife," she said softly. "What happened to her?" The motion of the stone stopped. Silence filled the room, thicker than storm. Jonas lifted his gaze, and for the first time she saw something raw within it, hesitation, pain uncloaked. "She gave me this chair," he said at last, his voice low, hoarse. "And she gave me silence. She died giving me both." His hand touched the rifle as if to steady himself. Childbirth. House went quiet after that. Too quiet. Clara pressed the shawl closer about her, the weight of his words cutting clean through her. She wanted to answer, to tell him she understood, that death had stolen laughter from her home as well. But the words clung heavy to her throat. She only bowed her head, as one mourner does to another across an open grave. Jonas set down the stone. His scarred hand lingered over the rifle, then fell to his side. He did not look at her again, but she felt something shift in the air, a wall cracked, if only by a single hairline fracture. That night Clara dreamed of her husband's funeral. She saw again the raw earth shoveled over, the bowed heads, the way Eliza clung to her skirts as though afraid she, too, would be swallowed. She woke with tears on her face, and this time she did not hide them. She pressed her hand to her daughter's sleeping form and let the grief pass through her like a tide. In the other room she heard Jonas rise from his chair, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. For a moment she imagined him pausing, listening, knowing. She did not call out. Neither did he. Yet something had changed. The house was still cloaked in silence, but it no longer belonged to one man alone. It was a silence shared, fractured by honesty, warmed by the faint possibility of trust. The warning came with the thaw. One brittle morning, Jonas rode into town for supplies, leaving Clara and Eliza to tend the stove and sweep the hearth. He returned at dusk, his face shadowed, his voice stripped down to the bone. Word had spread along the valley, 2 ranches to the south had been burned. Cattle driven off, barns in ruin, a family vanished. Clara felt the blood drain from her cheeks. She drew Eliza closer, the child's hand small against her own, and listened as Jonas set his rifle on the table with deliberate care. He said little more, but his silence carried weight enough. That night he worked by lantern, oiling the rifle until it gleamed, checking the powder horn, tightening the straps on his saddle gear. He moved with the patience of habit, as though each action was one he had repeated countless times before, one he did not welcome but accepted as inevitable. Clara watched from the doorway, shawl wrapped tight, her braid brushing her shoulder. She knew the rhythm of preparing for battle, not from war but from death itself. She had once sat at her husband's bedside through fever, listening to his breath falter, knowing each moment might be the last. She remembered the helplessness, the endless waiting. She could not sit idle again. "I'll stand with you," she said quietly. Jonas looked up, startled, then hardened. "This isn't your fight." Her chin lifted. "It became mine the day I was left on that trail." His scar caught the lantern's glow, deepening the furrow across his face. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he lowered his gaze to the rifle and slid it back into place. "Suit yourself," he muttered. Clara moved to the fire, adding wood until it flared bright. Eliza slept nearby, curled on the rug, her doll tucked beneath her chin. The cabin held its breath as Jonas and Clara settled into their vigil. Outside, the night pressed heavy. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries carried thin across the snowfields. Every crack of ice, every whisper of wind set Jonas's hand twitching toward the rifle. Clara sat opposite him, shawl drawn close, her eyes fixed on the flames. She thought of her husband, how he would have faced this moment, and of how little choice she had now. To live was to fight, even if all one held was courage itself. Hours passed. The fire burned low, flaring now and again as wood shifted. Jonas paced once, twice, then stopped at the window, staring into the dark. Clara followed his gaze but saw nothing but shadows. "You've done this before," she said at last. His voice was quiet, rough. "Too many times." He did not explain, and she did not ask. The silence between them was taut, stretched thin like wire, yet within it grew something strange, not fear, but a recognition of standing side by side, of sharing watch against the same darkness. Toward dawn, the tension broke. A rider's silhouette moved against the ridge, then another, faint against the paling sky. Jonas tensed, rifle ready. Clara rose, her heart hammering, but the figures lingered only a moment before wheeling away, vanishing into the hills. They waited. No attack came. The valley held its silence. At last Jonas lowered the rifle, his breath leaving him slow. Clara sat again, her legs trembling, though she hid it beneath the shawl. Relief tasted bitter, like fear that had nowhere to go. The fire burned low, the embers glowing soft as dawn touched the frost on the window. Jonas returned to his chair, his shoulders sagging in a way she had not seen before. He poured coffee into 2 cups and set one before her. Their hands brushed as she reached for it, a fleeting contact, warm against the chill. Neither spoke of it. Clara sipped slowly, the steam rising between them. She glanced at Jonas, at the line of his scar, at the weariness that deepened the set of his mouth. For the first time, she did not see ugliness. She saw endurance, carved into flesh by a world that demanded more than most men could bear. Jonas watched her in turn, the braid that had fallen loose across her shoulder, the determination in her eyes even now, after a night spent in fear. She was not fragile as he had first believed. She was tempered iron, bending but not breaking. They said nothing, but the firelight between them seemed to burn differently. Not just warmth against the cold, but a tether, invisible yet undeniable. On the rug, Eliza stirred. "Half asleep," she murmured, "we're not alone anymore." Her voice was faint, barely more than a dream, but it filled the room. Clara's eyes stung. She lowered her cup, fingers trembling, and let the words linger in the air. Jonas shifted in his chair, gaze turned to the fire, though his jaw worked as though holding something unspoken. The cabin walls still bore the marks of storm, the valley still held danger, but something inside had shifted. The silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of those who had stood together through a night when the world threatened to break, and found each other still standing come dawn. Later, when Eliza woke fully, she climbed into the rocking chair, her legs swinging, her doll in her lap. Jonas paused behind her, one hand briefly brushing the chair's back. Clara saw it and did not look away. She only drew her shawl closer and breathed in the scent of coffee and smoke, the fragile peace of morning. The fire crackled, low but steady. It was no longer only theirs to tend alone. Spring did not arrive gently. The snowmelt roared down the gullies, flooding low ground, and the cabin groaned as though exhaling a winter's worth of sorrow. Jonas repaired fence lines that the thaw had loosened, while Clara and Eliza gathered the first shoots of green pushing through the softened earth. The air was damp, heavy with the promise of change. It was on such a morning that two wagons passed along the trail, their wheels creaking, their drivers pausing long enough to trade news. Clara stood in the yard, apron dusted with flour, Eliza clinging to her skirt, as the men tipped their hats and spoke. They bore word from the east, word of her late husband's kin. Her in-laws had sent message through the chain of travelers. Clara was expected to return. The West was no place for a widow, they said. She had no claim, no protection, and a child's future to consider. The wagons rolled on, leaving only ruts in the thawing road. But their words lingered like frost that would not melt. That evening Clara sat by the hearth, shawl wrapped close though the fire was warm. Jonas worked in silence at the table, mending a saddle strap. She studied the line of his jaw, the scar that had grown familiar, and wondered what it meant to belong. "They want me back," she said at last, her voice low. Jonas did not look up. "Who?" "My husband's kin. They say it isn't fit, a woman staying on out here." The leather strap slipped in his hands. He set it aside carefully, then met her gaze. His eyes held no demand, no pleading, only the flat honesty of a man who had lived too long with choices made for him. "The choice is yours," he said. "No one will hold you here." Clara turned her face to the fire. Freedom was not comfort, it was weight. She thought of the trail where she had been abandoned, of the shawl she had wrapped tighter each night, of Eliza's small hand gripping hers in silence. To go back east was to step again into the shadow of others' decisions. To remain was to walk into the unknown, yet with dignity intact. Before the decision could root, dawn brought reckoning. The first shot shattered the morning calm. Jonas was already at the door, rifle in hand, when the riders appeared from the tree line, shadows breaking into full form, their cries sharp against the waking sky. "Raiders!" Clara pulled Eliza back, heart hammering, but Jonas's voice cut through the clamor, "Stay inside." He moved with grim precision, firing from the porch, each report echoing across the yard. Yet for every rider he drove back, another pressed close. The barn doors shook beneath blows. The fence splintered. Jonas's silhouette against the pale light was one man against many, and Clara knew what it meant to watch someone she cared for be swallowed by fate. She saw Eliza clutching the bone charm, its edges worn smooth from the child's hand. Protection, given once in silence, carried now like a covenant. Clara's breath steadied. She reached for the second rifle propped by the door. Jonas turned, eyes wide with protest, but she did not falter. She stepped onto the porch beside him, shawl whipping in the wind. The wood was solid beneath her feet, the barrel firm in her grip. She remembered long nights with fever, the steadiness it had taken to hold her husband's hand as life ebbed away. Steadiness now would mean something else, it would mean survival. She lifted the rifle, sighted along the barrel, and fired. The shot rang true. Jonas glanced at her, something unspoken flashing across his scarred face. Not anger, not fear, but recognition. Together they held the line. The attackers pressed hard, but each shot, each defiant stand, sent them scattering. At last, with the sun breaking full over the ridge, the raiders wheeled away, vanishing into the hills, leaving only smoke and churned earth behind. The silence afterward was heavier than the battle. Jonas staggered to the porch, his breath ragged, and sank onto the step. Clara followed, kneeling beside him, the rifle slipping from her hands. Without thinking, she spread her shawl over them both, her shoulder against his. Eliza stood in the doorway, clutching her doll, her eyes wide but unafraid. Jonas let out a long breath, the kind that carries years of solitude with it. Clara rested her hand lightly on his arm. No words passed, for none were needed. Weeks later, the valley greened. The thaw gave way to wildflowers along the trail, and the creek ran clear once more. When at last they rode into town, it was not as three fragments bound by chance, but as a unit shaped by fire and silence. Jonas sat tall in the saddle, Clara beside him, Eliza perched between, her braid bouncing with each hoofbeat. People watched as they passed, curiosity flickering in their eyes. But Clara no longer felt the sting of judgment. She rode with her shawl drawn close, not as armor, but as a mantle she had chosen. Jonas rode in silence, as ever, but it was a silence different now, no longer the silence of loss, but the silence of a man who had something worth guarding again. When they returned to the ranch, the porch greeted them with its familiar stillness. Yet the rocking chair no longer stood empty. That evening Eliza curled in it with her doll, feet swinging, while Jonas brewed coffee and Clara set bread on the table. The firelight painted the walls, soft and steady. Outside, the wind carried spring scent. No vows were spoken, no promises declared. But the bond had been forged, tempered in storm and fire. They were no longer bound by pity or by obligation. They were bound by survival, by dignity restored, by a love that did not need words to exist. The rocking chair creaked, steady as a heartbeat, as the night settled around them. And for the first time in many seasons, the house felt full.